Hey everybody, and welcome to a brief video that will be on the formation of civilization in China. So China, like all earliest civilizations, formed along river valleys, and the birthplace of Chinese civilization is the Huanghe River, also known as the River of Sorrows. Right, it runs through northern China. Beijing, the current capital, is situated alongside it. But this northern area in China here, that's really kind of like the heartland of Chinese civilization. Civilization didn't start to expand southward until a little bit later. This is also known as the Yellow River because of the light-colored soil that it picks up along the route. You see this picture of it here. It kind of has, I know, a little bit of like a brownish color to it, but at times it does get almost yellow looking. And the soil often builds up the overall volume of the river, and this leads to devastating floods. Because it caused so much destruction over the centuries, it's been nicknamed the River of Sorrows. Despite this, though, the Huanghe and other rivers allowed Chinese civilization to take shape as early as 5000 BCE. So Chinese civilization is very, very old. It's one of the most uninterrupted Chinese civilizations in the history of the world. And Chinese history is defined by its dynasties. And there are three ancient dynasties that have an almost mythic quality about them since they're so old. The first is the Xia dynasty. And records of the Xia dynasty are very scarce, but it's believed that it started around 2200 BCE or so and established the precedent of hereditary monarchy. Right? It gets passed down from father to son and so forth. And we call this a dynasty. And this is where it starts in China. Now, legend says that the next dynasty was the Shang dynasty, and that this took control around 1750 BCE. And this ruled to about 1122. We know a little more about them than the Xia because they left written documents. They were particularly known for their use of bronze metallurgy. Remember, metallurgy is just a fancy word for using metals for different things. The use of bronze reached China from the Middle East through Central Asian trade routes before the Shang came to power. But the Shang rulers made use of it for weapons on a much larger scale. They ruled over a largely, let's see the pictures there of, you got your bronze sword and your bronze axe. Bronze doesn't hold up all that well as iron. It doesn't last as long, and obviously it rots a lot longer over time. But they ruled over a largely decentralized state. All right, the ruling elites, they held most of the power. All right, so let's talk about the Zhou dynasty, because the Shang were displaced in the 12th century BCE by these guys, the Zhou, and they needed to justify their rule among the local elites. They did this through a concept called the Mandate of Heaven. So the Mandate of Heaven is also tied into this thing called the dynastic cycle, and it states that the gods grant the right to rule to whoever they think is deserving. So mandate essentially means approval. Rulers are a link between heaven and earth, and they are referred to, therefore, as the Son of Heaven. So you start up here at the top, and a new dynasty is born, and then everything's good, and the government becomes corrupted as time goes on, and then you start having natural disasters and famine and wars, and taxes go up. The commoners become unhappy with it, and then this part here, because of all the bad stuff, the dynasty is considered to have lost the mandate, and then there is a rebellion, a revolution of some kind, and then what happens? New dynasty is born, and it starts all over again. So that's why it's called a cycle. Of particular note with the Zhou was, throughout all of this cycle as they consolidate rule, was the use of iron weapons. What was both interesting and ironic, let me move me out of the way so you can see the cool swords. So even though the style of them is very similar, you notice a difference in appearance between this and the previous one. Now, bronze gets a lot more corrupted over the centuries. Iron holds up pretty well. It's just a stronger substance. What was both interesting and ironic was that the Zhou rulers themselves were actually hurt by the use of iron. Zhou rulers failed to control the production of iron weapons, and local rulers did this for themselves. This had the impact of decentralizing the bureaucracy. Local rulers controlled the production of iron weapons, as we said, and this gave them more power to build their own private armies, and it led to an increase in conflict among the warlords. This breakdown of centralized rule led to the downfall of the Zhou dynasty and a violent time known as the Period of Warring States. So you see the map here. Let me erase the other stuff so you don't get confused. So during this time period, it wasn't that it was constant civil war, but there was no strong centralized rule. And it was for a fairly long time period. You see over 200 years, 475 to 221. And there was no emperor, right? There was no centralized leadership. The states fought amongst themselves, and they would continue until the Qin dynasty re-centralizes everything in 221. But we'll talk about that in a later chapter. So just a quick overview of some things with society and family. Now, with family unit was a very important part of Chinese culture, even today. And that tradition goes back centuries. An example is the veneration of ancestors. This practice goes back to Neolithic times, and as you can see by the picture, is still a big part of Chinese culture in the present day. And played an important role in the early dynastic period that we're talking about now. It wasn't necessarily worshiping ancestors as gods. It was more the belief that the spirits of their ancestors, of grandma and grandpa and so forth, that they could look after you and that they could communicate with the gods on your behalf. It represented a cooperation of the family at all levels, right? Not only all the ones alive, but also even the ones that are dead. China also had a strictly patriarchal society. This intensified by the Shang and the Zhou periods. Women actually had a little better in the very, very early periods, but they became increasingly subject to the wills of their husbands. Men had total control of their families, and only male ancestors were worshipped. Now, Chinese society had very similar social divisions that we see in other ancient societies. The elites were at the top, right? So you see, you've got the king, royal family, nobles, warriors, and they controlled everything. They controlled the land, they controlled resources, they controlled taxes. And you had a small middle class of artisans and craftsmen. Merchants were not yet very prominent. Trade definitely existed since it brought metallurgy and military technology from the Middle East, but it didn't emerge into a large merchant class yet. That is going to come a little later. Peasants made up the vast majority of the population, and there was also a sizable population of slaves, most of whom were POWs, right? These were prisoners of war captured by different states. And like all civilizations, ancient China employed writing. That's how we know about all this stuff. Now, writing was used for government purposes, but unfortunately, pretty much all of those records are gone since they were written on things like bamboo and silk, and they get destroyed over the years. What we do know about Chinese writing from this period comes from oracle bones. Now, oracle bones were used by fortune tellers. And you would take bones, mostly of animals. They weren't really used for human bones. Let me just erase this. There we go. And they would write a question to the gods on it, and then they would put it in the fire. And as the heat would cause the bone to kind of crack and expand and things like that, the diviners, the fortune tellers, would then interpret the cracks and use that to say that they could answer and interpret what the questions were. Writing became more prominent in the Zhou period, and this led to collections such as the Book of Songs. You can see it enough. I don't need to move me. Which is, a large collection of poems and considered to be one of the oldest collections of poems in the world. So I know it kind of seems like I just rushed through a certain amount of things, and I did, but it's not really necessary to go into stuff in tremendous detail. So I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the foundations of civilization in China.